Tokaimura nuclear accident. On September 30th, 1999, 35-year-old Hisashi Ochi walked into the Tokaimura nuclear fuel processing plant in Japan. For what should have been a routine shift, Ochi worked as a technician at the plant, mixing uranium fuel for a research reactor. That morning, he and two coworkers were rushing to meet a deadline. To save time, they decided to skip the proper safety protocols and mixed 7 times more uranium than regulations allowed, pouring it directly into a steel bucket instead of using the approved equipment. The bucket suddenly began glowing with an eerie blue light. The mixture had gone critical, unleashing a nuclear chain reaction right in front of him. Ochi was standing just 2 feet away when it happened. In less than a second, his body absorbed 17 sieverts of radiation. To put that in perspective, a single sievert can cause radiation sickness. 5 sieverts will kill half the people exposed to it within a month. Ochi had just absorbed more radiation than any human had ever survived. Within minutes, Ochi began vomiting. His skin turned red like a severe sunburn. Ochi was hospitalized immediately, but the damage was already done. The radiation had destroyed the DNA in his cells, making it impossible for his body to produce new blood cells or repair damaged tissue. After 83 days of continuous suffering, on December 21, 1999, Ochi died from multiple organ failure. Ochi's death led to the permanent shutdown of the Tokaimura facility, criminal prosecutions of 6 company officials for negligence, and a complete overhaul of Japan's nuclear safety regulations, requiring independent safety inspections at all nuclear facilities. The Demon Core. On August 21, 1945, 24-year-old physicist Harry Daghlian was working alone at Los Alamos Laboratory late at night. Daghlian was building a neutron reflector around a plutonium core. The experiment was a deadly game of chicken, testing how close they could push the core to starting a self-sustaining nuclear reaction, known as criticality, without crossing the line. At 9:55 p.m., Daghlian reached for another brick. As he moved it toward the assembly, his radiation detector suddenly screamed. He had brought the core too close to criticality. Daghlian panicked and tried to pull the brick away, but it slipped from his hand and fell directly onto the plutonium core. Without thinking, Daghlian knocked the brick off with his bare hand, stopping the reaction but absorbing a massive dose of radiation in the process. He had just seconds to save his own life, but his instinct to stop the reaction sealed his fate. Within hours, Daghlian's hand began swelling to twice its normal size. The skin turned red, then purple, then black. Over the next 25 days, he lost weight rapidly, dropping from 160 pounds to just 110. He died on September 15, 1945, in unimaginable pain. The plutonium core he had been working with would later become known as the Demon Core. His death led to new safety protocols requiring at least 2 people present during all criticality experiments and the installation of automatic radiation alarms throughout Los Alamos. The killer screwdriver. On May 21, 1946, physicist Louis Slotin was conducting a dangerous experiment at Los Alamos National Laboratory in New Mexico. The 35-year-old Canadian scientist was demonstrating a procedure his colleagues had nicknamed tickling the dragon's tail. The experiment involved bringing 2 beryllium reflector shells around a plutonium core, stopping just short of triggering a nuclear reaction. He had performed this same experiment dozens of times before, but today, something went wrong. Slotin was working with a plutonium core about the size of a softball, the same demon core that had killed Harry Daghlian just 8 months earlier. 7 other scientists stood in the room watching as Slotin carefully lowered the top reflector shell closer to the plutonium core. His hand was completely steady. At exactly 3:20 p.m., the screwdriver slipped from his hand, and with it, Louis Slotin's fate. The 2 halves of the reflector snapped together around the plutonium, starting the deadly nuclear reaction. Without thinking, Slotin knocked the reflector shells apart with his bare hand, stopping the reaction and saving everyone else in the room. When Slotin looked down at his left hand, it was already turning red and starting to swell. Even though he knew he was dying, his first thought was documenting everything to help the others survive. Within minutes, Slotin began vomiting violently. His colleagues rushed him to the hospital, where doctors examined him and delivered the news he already knew. He had absorbed more than twice the lethal dose of radiation. On May 30th, just 9 days after the accident, Louis Slotin died from massive organ failure. His death led to immediate changes at Los Alamos. All future criticality experiments had to be conducted remotely using machines instead of screwdrivers, and the demon core itself was melted down and never used again. The tickling the dragon's tail experiments were permanently banned as well. The flash of death. On December 30th, 1958, Cecil Kelly, a 38-year-old chemical operator, was working at the Los Alamos plutonium processing facility. His job was to mix plutonium solutions, a process that he had done safely thousands of times. That morning, Kelly climbed a ladder to check on a large mixing tank containing plutonium dissolved in organic solvent. He had no idea that the plutonium had settled at the bottom of the tank in a concentrated layer. When Kelly turned on the stirrer at 10:35 a.m., the blades mixed the plutonium into a critical mass. The solution exploded with a brilliant flash of blue light. He had been standing directly above the tank, and his body absorbed a massive dose of radiation in less than a second. Kelly screamed and collapsed off the ladder. His co-workers found him unconscious on the floor and rushed him to the hospital. For a few minutes, doctors thought he might survive. He briefly regained consciousness and mumbled a few words, but the radiation had destroyed his central nervous system. Within 5 hours, Cecil Kelly was dead. The accident investigation revealed that the mixing tank's design was flawed, allowing plutonium to accumulate in dangerous concentrations without any warning system. Kelly's death led to the complete redesign of all plutonium processing equipment at Los Alamos, and new regulations requiring fail-safe geometry in vessels to prevent criticality even if procedures were violated. The polonium drink. On November 1, 2006, Alexander Litvinenko, a 43-year-old former Russian intelligence officer living in London, met two men for tea at the Millennium Hotel. Litvinenko had defected from Russia and spent years criticizing the Russian government and President Vladimir Putin. He claimed the FSB had ordered him to assassinate Russian oligarch Boris Berezovsky, and that the 1999 Russian apartment bombings, which killed 300 people and justified the war in Chechnya, were actually carried out by Russian intelligence services. These accusations made him a target. That afternoon, someone slipped polonium-210 into his drink that would kill him gradually and painfully. At first, Litvinenko just felt sick to his stomach and thought it was food poisoning, but over the next few days, his condition got worse. Doctors ran test after test, but couldn't figure out what was wrong with him. Meanwhile, Litvinenko kept getting sicker. Finally, on November 23rd, Britain's atomic weapons establishment tested samples from his body and discovered he had been poisoned with polonium-210, one of the most toxic substances on Earth. Someone had put a lethal dose in his tea, and he had swallowed it without knowing. Alexander Litvinenko died on November 23, 2006, exactly 3 weeks after being poisoned. British investigators traced a radiation trail across London using Geiger counters, finding polonium contamination in hotel rooms, restaurants, offices, and even on the British Airways planes that the two men who Litvinenko met, Lugovoy and Kovtun, had flown. Britain requested the extradition of Andrei Lugovoy for murder, but Russia refused, and Lugovoy was later elected to the Russian parliament, giving him immunity from prosecution. The incident strained relations between Britain and Russia for years, leading to diplomatic expulsions and economic sanctions. The K-19 submarine incident. On July 3, 1961, 23-year-old Soviet naval officer Boris Korchalov boarded the submarine K-19 for his first deployment as commander of the Emergency Repair Group. The sub was the Soviet Union's first nuclear-powered ballistic missile submarine, built in a rush to match American naval power. Sailors called it Hiroshima after a champagne bottle failed to break at its launching, a bad omen they couldn't ignore. On July 4th, while conducting exercises off Greenland, a cooling pipe cracked in the starboard reactor at 4:15 a.m. Without coolant, the sub's reactor temperature began climbing rapidly and would soon trigger a nuclear explosion. There was no backup cooling system because the sub had been rushed into service and safety systems were still incomplete. The only option to prevent nuclear meltdown was to manually weld pipes inside the reactor compartment, but whoever went in would be exposed to lethal radiation. The captain asked for volunteers. 22 men, including Korchalov, stepped forward, risking their lives. The group was divided into teams of 3, rotating in and out of the reactor compartment every 5 to 10 minutes to limit radiation exposure. When the first team, including Korchalov, opened the door of the compartment, they saw a blue light emanating from the pipes. They thought it was fire, but it was ionized radiation shining in the air. 5 minutes later, Korchalov stumbled out of the reactor room. He ripped off his gas mask and vomited yellow foam. Within hours, his face swelled and his skin turned red. He had received an enormous amount of radiation from being directly exposed. The crew succeeded in preventing a meltdown and hence the nuclear explosion, but Korchalov died on July 10, 1961, just 6 days after the incident. 7 other volunteers died within days, and 14 more within 2 years. Their bodies were so radioactive that they had to be buried in lead coffins in secret locations. The accident remained classified for decades, but in 2006, the K-19 crew was nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize for preventing a disaster that could have started World War III. The radium water millionaire. On a fall evening in 1927, Eben Byers, a 51-year-old millionaire industrialist and champion golfer, boarded a train from New York to Pittsburgh. During the journey, he fell from his sleeping berth and injured his arm. The pain lingered for weeks. His doctor recommended a popular new medicine called Radithor, bottled water containing radium that manufacturers claimed could cure everything. After trying Radithor for his arm pain, Byers became convinced it was a miracle cure. He started drinking 2 to 3 bottles every day, sometimes more. The manufacturer loved him because he was their best advertisement, a famous wealthy man publicly endorsing their product. Over the next 3 years, Byers would go on to consume an estimated 1,400 bottles of Radithor. He stopped his consumption in October 1930 after losing most of his teeth and experiencing other negative side effects like weight loss and headaches. In 1931, surgeons had to remove his entire lower jaw and most of his upper jaw. However, due to radium's chemical similarity with calcium, Byers' body had already absorbed it into his bones, where it emitted radiation continuously. On March 31, 1932, just 2 years after he stopped drinking Radithor, Byers died of radium poisoning in a New York hospital. His body was so radioactive it had to be buried in a lead-lined coffin. The Wall Street Journal published his story under the headline, "The Radium Water Worked Fine Until His Jaw Came Off," garnering nationwide attention. Byers' death led to the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act of 1938, which gave the FDA power to regulate medical products and require safety testing before marketing. If you'd like to see more stories like this, make sure to subscribe and feel free to drop suggestions for the next video in the comments.